Iris Murdoch was a thinker of exceptional breadth and ambition. During her lifetime, she was perhaps best known as a novelist, and she published 26 novels, exploring themes like good and evil, self-knowledge and self-deception, and the complexities of sexual relationships. She achieved an extraordinary level of popular success, and many of the novels were also critically well received. In 1978, for example, her novel The Sea was awarded the Booker Prize, and in 2008, she was listed 12th in the Times' list of the 50 greatest British writers since 1945. In addition to her work as a novelist, she also wrote many other literary works, including plays and poetry, and made several radio and television appearances. Although most famous as a novelist, that was only one part of her professional life. She was also a philosopher, and a very successful one. After studying at Oxford and Cambridge, she taught philosophy at St Anne's College, Oxford, for many years, before leaving to teach philosophy part-time at the Royal College of Art. Over the course of her life, she published 3 philosophical monographs and 2 collections of philosophical essays, on topics as varied as ethics to aesthetics, to the history of philosophy, to the philosophy of language, and more. Today, I'll be focusing on Murdoch's philosophical work rather than her novels, and giving an overview of her key philosophical ideas and themes, focusing on her moral philosophy. I'll first start by saying something about her life and the philosophical context she was working in, the influences on her philosophical thought. I'll then sketch her moral psychology, her conception of what constitutes the moral life, the obstacles to moral progress, and what it is that helps us to do better. I'll go on to talk about her conception of the good and the role that that plays in her thought. So, Murdoch in her context. Murdoch was born in 1919, and in 1938 she went up to Somerville College, Oxford, where she studied greats, basically classics, from 1938 to 1942. In Oxford at the time, the philosophical spirit of the era was reductionist and very sceptical about metaphysical speculation. The human mind was being reduced to behaviour, human values to mere emotions, and the variety of moral life to something capturable in a simple consequentialist calculus. A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic had just been published in 1936, which epitomised this kind of reductionist analysis, and by all accounts Oxford was captivated by it. Despite finding herself in that kind of philosophical environment, Murdoch couldn't have been more deeply opposed to this kind of philosophy. Mary Midgley later reports that she was always philosophically unfashionable and refreshingly content to be so. She arrived at Oxford on the cusp of World War II, and after the outbreak of the war, the university was transformed. Many of the younger, able-bodied men left to fight, and Murdoch and her contemporaries ended up being taught by those left behind, a generation of older scholars, conscientious objectors, and those unable to fight. That exposed Murdoch to kinds of philosophical outlook that she might not otherwise have encountered in her studies. There was an outlook that was perhaps more historically oriented, more interested in the moral and spiritual life, and less nervous of metaphysics, all of which would be hallmarks of Murdoch's own later work. One significant influence was that of Donald Mackinnon, a philosopher and theologian to whom he was sent for tutorials. Murdoch was deeply impressed by Mackinnon's moral and religious seriousness, and she was later described as holding him in reverence. Mackinnon also taught Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, and Mary Midgley, 3 of Murdoch's peers with whom she would come to share close friendships and philosophical discussion. In addition to introducing Murdoch to approaches to philosophy that she might not otherwise have encountered, the war had a huge effect on the social and academic dynamics of the university. All 4 of the female philosophers I've just mentioned were strikingly successful, surprisingly so for a discipline that has often been rather male-dominated and was particularly so at the time. In later years, Mary Midgley would put this down to the absence of men during their time as undergraduates. It gave the women, she suggested, a space in which to try to work through deep philosophical puzzles together, rather than simply trying to compete at winning clever arguments. Certainly, one way or another, it provided an environment in which the 4 flourished intellectually. So Murdoch had an unusual philosophical education. She was introduced to the kinds of logical and linguistic analysis that were common in Oxford at the time, and that continued to thrive after the war. But she was also familiar with less orthodox approaches in Anglophone philosophy, and both of these had some influence on her thinking. After leaving Oxford, Murdoch worked for a couple of years in London for the Treasury, and then for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, where she was stationed in Belgium and in Austria. While she was in Europe, she met Jean-Paul Sartre, who she was initially very impressed by. She would go on to write the first monograph about Sartre in English, by which time, however, she was much more critical of his work. Throughout her life, however, she would engage seriously with both analytic and continental philosophy, and far from distancing these, would suggest that very similar paradigms were assumed in both. After returning to the UK, she briefly studied as a postgraduate at Newnham College, Cambridge, where she then hoped to study with Wittgenstein. Unfortunately, she'd arrived just too late for that, and they only met once. By the time the year was out, however, she was made a Fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford, where she would be based for the next few years. Her career went off to a flying start. She was invited, for instance, to give talks at prestigious philosophical meetings, such as the Aristotelian Society, and she gave a paper at the joint session, to which one of Oxford's most respected philosophers, Gilbert Ryle, was a respondent. By 1954, she'd published both her first monograph on Sartre and her first novel, Under the Net. But she seemingly withdrew somewhat from the academic world as time went on and focused more closely on her literary writing. In 1963, she left her post at St Anne's, and she taught part-time at the Royal College of Art for the next few years. Although somewhat withdrawn from the world of academic philosophy, she continued to write about and think about philosophy throughout. In 1982, she gave the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh, and over the next few years, she edited and reworked these ideas at length to make her final monograph, Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, which was published in 1992. She died in 1999, having suffered with Alzheimer's for the last years of her life. So, moving on to think about Murdoch's ethics, it might be useful to begin with her conception of moral life. My starting point will be the question, what is the moral life? What does the moral life consist of? One very common and influential answer within moral philosophy, both today and for Murdoch's contemporaries, is that the core domain of morality is limited to action. Actions are the fundamental locus of our moral lives. And actions are understood in a very specific and narrow sense as overt, external, public events, in the sense of being identifiable by any reasonable observer. Murdoch writes, on this view, the moral life of the individual is a series of overt choices which take place in a series of specifiable situations. It's assumed that both the situation in which the agent finds themselves and the actions that are available to them, the options that the agent picks from, are specifiable from a more or less neutral standpoint. So one's moral life, accordingly, consists in a series of actions or action choices, namely those actions where there's a difference in the moral value of the overt actions one could take. One common reason for taking this view of the domain of morality is the basically consequentialist thought that only our actions affect others, so only they matter. It surely does matter how our actions impact other people, a thought Murdoch herself of course acknowledges, and the obviousness of that thought might lead us to think that all of morality must be understood in such a way. Another important reason for taking this view of the domain of morality is that morality is possibly bound up with responsibility. Our moral lives are something we're legitimately held responsible for, and it might seem unfair to hold people responsible for things over which they have no immediate choice or direct control. On that kind of picture, the moral life is something that happens in discrete chunks, Much of life is non-moral, but we sometimes face choices where the options are of differing moral values. And these small sections of our lives where we make those choices are part of the moral domain. Murdoch, however, sets herself firmly in opposition to this conception of moral life. That picture of moral life, she suggests, ignores the fact that the nature and quality of our actions often depends on a complex background of vision and attention. The moral life, on her view, thus extends beyond merely outward action to how we see others and whether we attend adequately to them. In place of the view that morality is most fundamentally about action, she suggests that a broader notion of vision is at the core of moral life, somehow more explanatorily basic than action. So she says the activity and imagery of vision is at the centre of human existence. Correspondingly, the key moral activity is thus seen not as choice, but as attention, the activity that shapes our vision of the world. For Murdoch, the moral life is therefore not a discrete kind of thing that comes in isolated chunks, but continuous. We're always looking at something, and in doing so, we either build up a fairer, more just, more adequate picture of the world, or we distort our vision of it. The task of coming to see other people lovingly and justly is for her a key task of moral life. It might be useful here to look at one of Murdoch's examples, that of M and D, to see why she thinks that attention and vision can matter. So she writes, a mother-in-law, whom I shall call M, feels hostility to her daughter-in-law, whom I shall call D. M finds D quite a good-hearted girl, but while not exactly common, yet certainly unpolished and lacking in dignity and refinement. D is inclined to be pert and familiar, insufficiently ceremonious, brusque, sometimes positively rude, always tiresomely juvenile. M does not like D's accent or the way D dresses, and feels that her son has married beneath him. Let us assume, for purposes of the example, that the mother, who is a very correct person, behaves beautifully to the girl throughout, not allowing her real opinion to appear in any way. However, the M of the example is an intelligent and well-intentioned person, capable of self-criticism, capable of giving careful and just attention to an object which confronts her. So M tells herself, I'm old-fashioned and conventional, I may be prejudiced and narrow-minded, I may be snobbish. I am certainly jealous. Let me look again. Here, I assume that M observes D, or at least reflects deliberately about D, until gradually her vision of D alters. D is discovered to be not vulgar, but refreshingly simple, not undignified, but spontaneous, not noisy, but gay, not tiresomely juvenile, but delightfully youthful, and so on. So that's the case she offers, and in this case, it seems very intuitive to think that M is doing something morally bad in conceiving of D in the initial snobbish and hostile way. Her image of D isn't fair and is shaped by class and by gender in concerning ways. But of course, M is stipulated to have behaved beautifully to D despite this, so it's not going to influence her outward behaviour in any way. Still, we might think that how M sees D matters. Thinking about other people in a condescending tone is morally significant even if it never eventuates in outward action. Of course, if that line of thinking is right, then the action-centric view of morality is mistaken. Murdoch thus suggests that vision itself can be morally significant. For Murdoch, this example is sort of representative of our moral lives as a whole. We're always busy building up pictures of the world around us, and those pictures can be either enlightening and illuminating, or distorting and misleading, like M's initial vision of D. On Murdoch's picture, To distort one's conception of reality and fail to do justice to another person in one's vision of them is a key kind of moral failing. So why, according to Murdoch, is it that we tend to distort the world and view it in a way that fails to do justice to how it really is? Why is it so difficult to see one another truthfully or to attend adequately? Murdoch diagnoses the key problem here as the self, or the ego. The ego, she suggests, prevents us from seeing truly because it leads us to self-deceive or to fantasize. Murdoch identifies this tendency to fantasize as having two aspects: social convention and neurosis. So first, Murdoch suggests that the self, or ego, is what makes it so difficult to properly attend to one another. That is, we can be prevented from attending to others or from seeing them adequately because the ego gets in the way and obstructs or distorts our vision. On Murdoch's very loosely Freudian picture, the ego is anxious and utterly self-centered, utterly absorbed in itself and focused on protecting itself at all costs. It therefore ignores or distorts anything that isn't directly relevant to the self or inconvenient to it, even at the cost of losing one's grasp of reality. Murdoch writes, "We are anxiety-ridden animals. Our minds are continually active, fabricating an anxious, usually self-preoccupied, often falsifying veil which partially conceals the world." So the ego on this picture is ineradicably inward-looking. It pulls us into ourselves and our own concerns, and in doing so it obscures everything else. As such, it can distort our attention and vision, can induce us not to look at things that in fact matter, or can encourage us to distort what we should and could in fact see. It can therefore prevent us from truly seeing or understanding reality. And most importantly, it can prevent us from understanding other people. Murdoch therefore suggests that the ego pushes us to fantasize, to protect ourselves by seeing only what we wish to see or seeing only what concerns us, whether by ignoring certain other things altogether or by horribly distorting them. This fantasy contrasts with the imagination, in that although both are creative, fantasy is not truth-directed, but responsive to the desires of the ego. Such fantasies present us with a world reflecting our own desires and concerns, not a world as it truly is. So she writes, "The chief enemy of excellence in morality, and also in art, is personal fantasy. The tissue of self-aggrandizing and consoling wishes and dreams which prevents one from seeing what's there outside one." That is, the self, or ego, is dangerous, Murdoch suggests, because it so strongly incentivizes us to focus on ourselves and protect ourselves that we lose our grip of reality. Fantasy prevents us from engaging with reality, prevents us even from recognizing that reality. On this account, what N was initially doing when she was thinking about D was fantasizing. She wasn't really responsive to how D is, and she wasn't considering the fairest way to think about her. Her ego got in the way of really seeing how D is. More specifically, Murdoch identifies two particular obstacles to goodness, or as she puts it, two enemies of morals: social convention and neuroses. The idea here is that the ego can distort one's vision by unthinking reliance on social convention, like stereotypes and prejudices, or by more individualistic or direct concerns with the self. Both can block us off from others and from reality as a whole, and they combine to create pictures that have a great hold over us because they feed our egos whilst cutting us off from reality. We can see both of these elements in M's initial distorted image of D. M's caricature of D depends on class and gender stereotypes, as well as perhaps specific social conventions regarding mother and daughter-in-laws. And there's also an element of neurosis in M's caricature, this more individual fear, a fear that she's been displaced in her son's life or pushed to the edges of it by D. So what would enable us to overcome the ego? How is it, according to Murdoch, that we might become morally better? She insists that what's needed for moral progress to occur isn't merely to gain extra knowledge or to make better moral choices, but ultimately a reorientation of love. For Murdoch, what can counteract our egoism, our tendency to fantasize, is loving attention, a kind of just, patient, generous attention to reality. This, she thinks, is what will improve the moral quality of our vision and put us in touch with reality. Love, she insists, is a central concept in morals, and that is because, at least at its best, it draws us out of ourselves towards the world, towards the object of love, overcoming our habitual tendency to turn inwards. So she writes, "It is in the capacity to love, that is to see, that the liberation of the soul from fantasy consists." Loving attention, Murdoch claims, can liberate the soul from fantasy. In lovingly attending to others, we attend to something as a source of interest in its own right, perhaps value in its own right, not as something we care about merely in relation to ourselves and our own concerns. Such loving attention therefore enables us to get to the truth in a way that our ordinary looking, which is obviously often distorted by ego, by fantasy, does not. Loving attention is a kind of discerning attention that allows us to see things as they really are, and not merely in accordance with our self-centered fantasies. This, Murdoch thinks, is what M does when she says, "Let me look again," and reflects further on D. She's trying to be fair to her, trying to do justice to her, trying to see her as she really is. In short, M is trying to properly, adequately understand D, and that, Murdoch thinks, is an exercise in loving attention, in setting the ego aside and really coming to grasp the reality of another individual. This transition from fantasy to loving attention to reality can be brought out by turning to Murdoch's interpretation of Plato's allegory of the cave. This allegory is really important in her thinking as a model of moral life, and it recurs throughout her work. For Murdoch, this is all about a moral trajectory, or moral pilgrimage, as she sometimes calls it, which she takes to be central to moral life. That trajectory is the moral development each of us should undergo, from being caught up in our own fantasies and illusions to lovingly attending to reality and seeing it as it truly is. In Plato's allegory of the cave, prisoners are seated in a cave, chained up facing the cave wall. All they can see are the flickering shadows that are projected onto the wall from behind them, and they take those shadows to be reality. Loosed from their chains, a prisoner first sees the carvings which are casting the shadows onto the wall, and the fire behind them, which is the source of light in the cave. Eventually, they're led up and out of the cave to the real world, where they're pained by the light, and at first they struggle to look at real objects. Instead, they focus on shadows and reflections until gradually they accustom themselves to light and are able to look at objects themselves. Eventually, Plato suggests, the prisoner will be able to look directly at the source of illumination, the sun itself. Murdoch was very inspired by this image, and she makes much use of it in her work. She thought that it's a very good analogy for the moral life. On her reading, the fire represents the self, or the ego, which is of course that old, unregenerate psyche, that great source of energy and warmth. That fire represents our tendency to see everything and everyone in relation to ourselves, to our own desires and wishes, and our tendency to fantasize and ignore reality in doing so. The ascent up and out of the cave is the moral journey towards reality, towards realism, towards being able to recognize things as they really are, independently of that fire, independently of our ego. And Murdoch, like Plato, thinks of the sun, which illuminates everything, as the good. So on to the good. At the heart of Iris Murdoch's ethics is the good, a term which she typically capitalizes. This idea of the good is an idea she takes from Plato and develops in her own way. The good is supposed to be absolutely perfect and therefore infinitely distant from our imperfect lives, and yet ever present to us, discerned in and through the minutiae of our daily lives. The good, she suggests, is the ultimate object of moral knowledge and what's ultimately sought in our moral life. Moreover, she suggests that it's the object of our love. We respond to its magnetic appeal, even without conceptualizing it as such. It's an idea of perfection which we continually reach towards. That is, in our engagement with the particular good things of the world, we discern something of the good, and that good has a sort of continual magnetic draw for us. This might all sound quite a lot like the traditional Christian idea of God, and Murdoch's very interested in this parallel and draws on many theologians and religious thinkers in her work. In On God and Good, she suggests that there's a need in ethics to have a central, unifying concept of the good that has many of the core features of the concept of God. She writes, God was, or is, a single, perfect, transcendent, non-representable, and necessarily real object of attention. And I shall go on to suggest that moral philosophy should attempt to retain a central concept which has all these characteristics. Of course, the concept of the good does not, she thinks, have quite all of the features that God is typically thought to. In particular, whilst God is typically thought to be in some sense personal, Murdoch doesn't think of the good as personal. The good, as she thinks of it, doesn't care about or love us or anything else, for example. It's not a being with whom one might have a personal relationship. It simply is. It's something more like a standard, something external to us and with a certain authority over us that shapes every aspect of our lives. I want to spend a while unpacking each of these features that Murdoch thinks the good has. First, she says that there's a single good, just as Christian theologians have thought that there's a single God. By this, she means that there's a single supreme concept, one concept, that somehow provides a kind of loose unity to the variety of moral life, relating all the different aspects and concepts. And she thinks that the good is this supreme concept, which gives a kind of unity to moral life. But why think that there is any unity to moral life, which we need to capture? In answering that question, Murdoch turns to the idea of the unity of the virtues. That's an idea that was much discussed in ancient philosophy and that continues to appeal to many virtue ethicists today. The idea that the virtues are intrinsically interrelated. Murdoch suggests that if we look at the virtues, things like justice, humility, courage, love, we are constantly led to consider their relation to one another. That is, when we're trying to understand any one of the virtues, we find ourselves reaching for other virtues in order to fill out exactly what that first virtue is, what it requires of us. And this isn't a coincidence. It reflects the interrelations of the virtues themselves, and the fact that to fully possess any one virtue would require possessing lots of others. So she says, for example, the best kind of courage, that which would make a man act unselfishly in a concentration camp, is steadfast, calm, temperate, intelligent, loving. In other words, the virtues are interrelated, and you can't possess them in strict isolation from one another. To be a valuable kind of thing to have, courage has to be tempered by temperance, by love, and so on. To take another example, to really be just, you'd have to be compassionate and merciful too, for example. So there's a kind of unity between these seemingly distinct things. What's more, Murdoch suggests that when we think about these virtues, a kind of hierarchy also suggests itself. Some things, some virtues, will be more important, more foundational than others. And the most important, most basic kind of thing, Murdoch thinks, is the good. So, on her picture, there's a kind of unity to moral life and moral concepts, and the single supreme concept here is the good. On to the second attribute which Murdoch thinks both the good and God have, which is perfection. Murdoch thinks that it's very important to retain the idea of perfection in moral life, the idea of absolute good, absolute goodness, without limit and without blemish. A perfect standard, Murdoch thinks, is necessary in order to make sense of our understanding of the degrees of excellence which we find in the world. It gives, she suggests, a sense of direction, where we recognise that even for those things that are good, they're imperfect and they could be better. This kind of scale, this ordering of things where we recognise that some things are better than others, is something that will only stop at perfection. Until that point, there will always be respects in which a thing could be better. And it's only in the light of the idea of perfection, although of course it might be unarticulated, that we can make sense of degrees of perfection. In addition, it's very important to have this idea of perfection, because Murdoch thinks that only perfection will inspire the best kind of love in us. And we need that love to move us to become better, more virtuous human beings. She writes, the idea of perfection moves and possibly changes us as artist, worker, agent, because it inspires love in the part of us that's most worthy. A less than perfect ideal might inspire a less than perfect love. But she insists only a perfect ideal would be worthy of love in the part of us that's most worthy. We therefore need a not merely good, but perfect ideal to inspire the worthiest part of us and to draw us towards the good. Third, Murdoch says that the good, like God, is the concept of something transcendent. The good transcends our every experience of it, our every interaction with something that's good. We only ever experience the profoundly imperfect. Imperfect people, imperfect actions, imperfect situations. All of our experience is of limited, imperfect things. But the good is absolutely perfect, unlimitedly so. The good is thus behind and beyond the imperfect things of the world, transcending them, and perhaps even transcending any conception which we might try to form of it. This brings us then to the next feature of the good, that Murdoch says is that it's non-representable. That's closely connected to its transcendence. We can see particular imperfectly good things, good people, good actions, good situations. And we know the direction in which the good is to be found, at the top of the scale of goodness. So we do have some kind of grasp of the good and the direction it's to be found in. But these particular good things are not the good itself. The good itself is an abstract, perfect sort of thing, so it's not itself visible. What's more, she thinks that we can't give any very illuminating analysis of it, although we might be able to say some true things about it, because it transcends our imagination, our every attempt to grasp it. On to the next feature. Murdoch says that the good is not merely real, but necessarily real. The things in the world are contingent. I or you might well not have existed. Most things could have been otherwise than they are. But she suggests that the existence of the good is not like that. The good is not simply one thing among others that might not have existed. One way of getting at that idea is via our experience of the contingent things of the world. Think of any particular good thing. That thing might be contingent. It could not have been, it could have been otherwise. But the good is not like that. Whatever exists or fails to exist, we'd need that idea and that standard to make sense of those things. In making sense of anything at all, we make use of some conception of the good, a kind of standard that we hold ourselves to in trying to grasp how things really are. So unlike any particular contingent object, that standard couldn't have failed to have been. And in that sense, she thinks that it's necessarily real. Finally, Murdoch says that the good is an object of attention. So Murdoch suggests that there's a kind of ethical parallel to religious prayer. It consists in attention to the good. And that's very important for Murdoch, since she suggests that this attention to the good can help us in the crucial moral task of becoming better. An orientation to the good, she suggests, is a powerful kind of thing because it can provide us with a kind of energy that helps us to overcome our natural shortcomings and failings. To get a grip on that, think about how one might go about trying to become a better person. Merely deciding to be a better person, she very plausibly notes, is very unlikely to actually make one any better. One would still be caught up in one's own needs and desires and so on. The chances of improvement don't look terribly good. But if instead of simply deciding to become good, we give ourselves a new focus of our attention and desire, a different orientation, this may help. Attending to the good, or to things which are valuable, can, she thinks, reorient us and give us a kind of impetus or inspiration to actually become better. So those are the key features that Murdoch identifies as belonging to the good, and of course also to God. A single, perfect, transcendent, non-representable and necessarily real object of attention. So to sum up, Murdoch thinks that moral life is not just about outward, overt action. Our vision matters too, and is in a way more fundamental, more basic. On her account, it's hard to see rightly, to have the right kind of vision, because the ego gets in the way and we end up fantasizing instead. But we can morally improve, and we can do so by lovingly attending to reality and ultimately to the good. There's much more to Murdoch's thought than I've covered here, but I hope that's given a rough outline of some key contours of her moral philosophy, and I'd encourage you to take a look at her own works for more.